my biggest fear, hands down, is going back to prison. And for people who know me and they know my story, they know that throughout my incarceration, like, yo, like my life was completely changed. And that's ultimately through faith in Jesus Christ. I wasn't that same broken, hurt, violent kid just chasing the street dream, selling drugs, fighting, and robbing. Throughout my incarceration, yo, I found purpose. I found my identity as a man, and ultimately that's through faith in Jesus. So now, throughout my transition home back in society, yo, I'm not in the streets no more. I'm not trying to chase a fantasy of seeking fulfillment through street prestige. So people be like, bro, like, why would you even worry or think that it's a possibility that you could go back to prison? And I think that simply put, man, the reality is yo, I have been incarcerated the majority of my life. I've spent over 12 years in adult prison, and that's not even counting the juvenile programs and the juvenile detention stints. So from a young age, man, my mind, my psyche, I became institutionalized to where, as I share all the time, that my time in society, my time in the free world became vacations for me. And my home became prison or juvenile programs. That's what I was used to. That was my normal. So now being home, back in society, free for the longest I've ever been as an adult, yo, I still feel at times like there's a dark cloud, like just hanging over me, in which I am absolutely terrified that there is some slight possibility that somehow I could end back up in prison. And I mean, that's been my track record. I mean, time and time again, I would get out of prison, and I would say that I was going to do the right thing, and I was gonna stay out of I was gonna stay out of the streets. I was gonna stay out of trouble. But time and time again, I continued to not only prove other people wrong, who I was telling that to, but I was also like proving myself wrong because I continued to go back to jail, to go back to prison. And I think like psychologically, that was the thing that I would always wrestle with internally. Like, damn, bro, like I can't even trust myself with freedom or with right decision making. So even though now, man, praise be to God, my decision making has been consistent in doing the right thing, I still at times, man, am terrified that there is a possibility that I could somehow end back up in prison. And man, I think just one of the things that sticks out to me that shows how scared I am of going back to prison is the fact that, yo, I was dreaming the other day. And in my dream, it wasn't even really so much a nightmare. It was just in my sleep, I was dreaming that I was back incarcerated. And it was just one of those really vivid dreams to where like it was just a normal day in prison. I don't know if I'm going to child or I'm going to rec or I'm at my bunk in my cell or doing something, but in my dream, I was obviously in prison and it was very vivid. And when I woke up, I was sick to my stomach and I was just thoroughly disgusted. I remember just waking up thanking God that it was a dream. And the scariest call that I've had since I've been home is the fact that, yo, I almost did go back to prison. For those who know my story, I came home on CRD. And in the state of Florida, CRD is a type of parole. In the state of Florida, they don't have in the criminal justice system to where you can parole out of prison anymore. But with your 85%, prison time, if you get all your good time, your gang time, you're released, but you're released on CRD, which is conditional release. It's pretty much like probation, but it's parole because if you violate, you get sent back to prison. So for me, I had a 10 o'clock curfew. I couldn't go to any facilities like any bars or clubs that only serve alcohol. I couldn't leave the county without permission. So, technology is new to me. And I immediately became an iPhone junkie. But at first, I really didn't know how to work my iPhone like entirely. So like whenever I was setting up my iPhone at first, I guess like it was asking me questions about like, my sleep pattern or whatever. And I guess somehow like I put my phone on sleep mode to where at like 10 or 11 o'clock at night, my phone would automatically like go on silent and to where I wouldn't receive any calls. I mean, obviously you receive calls, but you're not notified. Your phone's not ringing, your text ain't dinging. So I have to have my phone on and ringing just in case my parole officer, he does curfew checks. But I wasn't aware that my phone was on sleep mode. I'm kind of green and ignorant when it comes to technology. And I think it was maybe only like my first week out. And I'm sleeping, and apparently my parole officer is blowing up my phone, outside of my apartment in his patrol car, trying to do a curfew check. And as he's calling, it's going straight, to my phone, but it's like on D&D, do not disturb, and I'm not hearing it ring. And for some reason, I don't know if I was sleeping. I woke up and went to the bathroom or something. I look at my phone and I see I had like 10 missed calls, and it's my parole officer. So immediately I'm calling. It's probably like maybe 5 o'clock in the morning. So he even texted me and said like, Mr. Testa, I'm outside. Where are you? So I'm blowing him up. He's not picking up the phone. I'm calling him back. I'm calling him back. I'm terrified because I know that if he does a curfew check and if I'm not home, I can get sent back to prison. So I'm absolutely terrified. I'm immediately videotaping myself in the kitchen, like showing the clock in the background, telling my parole officer, like, yo, I show him my apartment door. I get my MacBook. I show him the date and the time. Like, yo, I'm home. I was sleeping. My phone was on Do Not Disturb. I sent him the video. I'm still calling him. He's not picking up. So I'm up terrified. I had to wait till 8 o'clock in the morning to where he's finally in office. I call him, and he was pissed. Mr. Testa, that's a curfew violation. I can send you back to prison. And I'm just swearing to this man up and down that, yo, I was sleeping, man. I was asleep. And praise be to God, man, by the favor and grace of God, I didn't get violated. But he hung that over my head as a threat to turn in that curfew violation, and which could send me back to prison. But he was lenient on me because I just came home and because I explained to him how my phone was on D&D. I didn't even know it was on. So the whole point that I'm getting at, it was situations, and it is situations like that, especially still being in the system, even though I'm free, I'm living a life, that's crime free, I'm doing the right thing. It's still a cloud hanging over me that, yo, especially being on parole, like CRD, like there's a possibility, and I don't believe for me, but I mean, there is a possibility and a chance that you could violate and get sent back to prison. And all that time you did on parole don't even count. You got to do all that parole time, all that gang time back in the chain gang, back in prison. And I remember another time which I was terrified. It's probably the most terrifying time. I do Uber, as a side hustle. And during this time, I have a 10 o'clock curfew, but I was given permission by my parole officer to be out past 10 for business. So I'm driving. I got an Uber rider in the back, and it's probably not even 10 o'clock yet. It's like 9:50, and they have a whole bunch of police on the side of the road. And I don't even think they were marked cars. I think they were like unmarked. So for whatever reason, like police gets behind me, he's trailing me. He runs my tags. I'm sure he's seen my criminal record, and he pulls me over immediately. So they pull up, and I could tell just because right when they pulled me over, had the lights on, then immediately another cop car came up, and then another one. So they had three cop cars behind me. I got the Uber rider in the back. She's terrified. And I already know they're going to pull me out the vehicle and want to search me just because of my record. So right whenever they pull up to the window, I have my window down. They're like, Mr. Testa, man, you mind stepping out of the vehicle for a second? So I step out of the vehicle. And right as he's walking me to the back, he's like, yo, walk back here with me. So right as he's walking me back to my trunk, immediately he grabs my wrist. He turns me around and puts me in handcuffs. He says, Mr. Testa, man, you're on parole. Why are you out past your curfew? This is a violation. So my heart sank. I'm freaking terrified, because the first thought in my mind is like, yo, I'm going back to prison. I'm going back to prison for nothing. Even though I was given, that's one thing that's still scary about the system. Is like, yo, you're given like verbal permission from the parole officer. Like, I can be out past curfew for business. But, as I'm explaining that to the police, they're like, all right, like, we hear you saying that, but do you have anything written? Do you have like a written pass or something written with him signing it, or from like the state of Florida saying you're allowed to be out past your curfew? I'm like, nah, man, he told me, so he's like, all right, well, what's your parole officer? I give him my phone, and he's trying to call the parole officer, and they're getting his number. And I know it's like 10 o'clock. He's not going to pick up the phone. It's his work phone. So, man, I'm just terrified thinking that, yo, this could send me back to prison. And you always hear horror stories about that in prison, about people getting out doing the right thing, but because they're on probation or they're on CRD parole, like somehow they can get still hung up in the system, violate, and get sent back for nothing. And that's been my life, man, a revolving door of just incarceration after incarceration after incarceration. So man, I'm terrified. I'm praying, just asking God, please, for His favor, His grace, His mercy. So as the police and the squad car are calling like my parole officer, they got these two other cop cars standing in front of me, and they're like gang officers, gang task force undercover. So I had the opportunity to share with them my testimony about how the Lord transformed my life in the chain gang in prison, and how now I'm living, a law-abiding civilian lifestyle to where I'm in full-time ministry. I'm intentionally in the streets with the gospel and just doing right by my family, by my kids. And I was able to share my testimony and share the gospel with them. And that was an awesome and beautiful opportunity. So even though my parole officer didn't pick up the phone, they called his supervisor at shift. And man, by the favor of God, they let me go. And I wasn't violated. I just had to call the following morning, check in, make sure my parole officer was, cool with me being out working, which I was. But just a simple fact, man, that, I was working. I was pulled over because it was close to my curfew, like past my curfew as they pulled me. And, that situation could have sent me back to prison. So I think for anybody that's done any amount of prison time, especially a lot of prison time, and they break away from a lifestyle of crime and finally doing the right thing, that their biggest fear, I know speaking for myself, my biggest fear hands down is, going back to prison. Just because you've done that for so long and you're just so disgusted and over that part of your life. Though I wouldn't take back 1 day, 1 hour, 1 minute. I thank God because He used all of it to transform my life. By no means do I want to go back, unless it's to do ministry, to preach the gospel, to go visit a homie. Man, I do not, by no means ever. And this hands down my biggest fear in life is going back to prison. And it's funny too, because the other day I got in an argument with a friend of mine.